Disclaimer. I am a law student, and the legal information provided is not legal advice. For that, please hire an attorney. Hi! Let's begin with a hypothetical. Let's say that we have, you, the viewer, all right? And let's say that you woke up this morning and you found that the next president of the United States is not gonna be Donald Trump, but is rather Mr. Joseph Biden. Which is pretty cool in and of itself, right? That's pretty chill. Moment to celebrate. But, all right. Now, celebrations aside, let's say that you live in the state that's more conservative. All right? And let's say that you wake up and you see this and you're a more progressive person and you're like, oh my God, this is amazing. The world is, I finally have some life breathed back into me. I thought it was all over. I thought it was pointless. No, we're getting there. We're getting there. But let's say that you live in a conservative state. And let's say that you wake up and what you find is that when you wake up, you hear some commotion outside. Let's say that you live in a decently packed area. And let's say that what you end up hearing is the sound of a rally. And the Biden rally. Let's say that you go outside and you find that there is a Trump protest rally. All right? And so let's say that you go out there and you decide to see what the commotion is about. Because you're, I don't know, you feel pretty good about yourself. You're pretty knowledgeable. And thank you. But so let's say that you decide to go over to the rally. And you're doing everything safe. By the way, don't go to these kind of things alone. Always bring a person. But let's say that you go over there and you see, you walk up to 4 people. All right? And you walk up to all of them and you ask, hey, what's this all about? What's the problem? And they all say that we think that there was election fraud and that the outcome of this election is not lawful. It's not valid. And Biden is not our president. So you're like, okay, well, let me ask each of you individually why you think that. So you ask the first person, okay, first person, person A, why do you not believe that this election was valid? Person A looks at you and says, well, you know, on Twitter, I've been able to find 3 different instances where it's been alleged that either by virtue of some kind of miscalculation, some kind of error, or some possibly intentional malfeasance, that there has been some interference with the election results across the nation. All right, that's the first person. Let's say that you're like, all right, well, second person. Thank you, by the way. Let's say that you look at the second person and you're like, all right, well, why do you think that there's election fraud? And the second person looks at you and says, well, I think that there's a deep state conspiracy set up by pedophile rapists to control the entirety of the world and the nation, and that they specifically controlled the outcome of this election. To which you look at them and say, right. Sorry. And so you look at the third person, and you say, all right, you third person, why do you believe that there's election fraud? And the third person looks at you and says, well, I believe that there is legal justification that if Trump wanted to be able to halt the ballots by virtue of some kind of fear or suspicion of election fraud, that he should have been, because the ballots weren't stopped in time, then they shouldn't have called the election. And therefore, I think that there is a legal basis to be able to challenge the outcome of the election. All right? That's the third argument. You're like, okay, and last person, why do you not believe that this was a proper election? And the last person looks at you and says, well, I mean, haven't you been watching the news? Haven't you been listening to Trump and our politicians? Mail-in ballots are a corrupt system. Mail-in ballots only lead to harm. Mail-in ballots can't be trusted. The fact that we had to shift to mail-in ballots this year and the fact that that's where most of Biden's ballots came from, it's really suspicious to me. And it makes me think that something isn't right here. It makes me think that this is not trustworthy. Question. How would you respond to each of these 4 people? Hey everyone, how's it going? We're back, baby. I've been searching my soul to figure out what I wanted to do with my channel, but I think I got it. If you were with me yesterday, we actually did a lot of research on voting fraud and like the credibility of various voting fraud arguments. We're going to be going over all of them and some more today. But what I figured I would do, because I already put out a document entailing like all of the research, and we're going to go over it, and you should definitely look into it. I don't know if you can hear that Baltimore sounds. You should definitely take a look at that, but we're going to be going over it a little bit more later. But more importantly, what I want to do at this time, right? And this is something I don't think that a lot of people do here on the left, but I think it's very important, right? What I see are a lot of people who follow really smart content creators, really great people, and who know the basic nuts and bolts, like who know all of the right knowledge to be able to put themselves into the right kind of ideological positions, but who don't know how to make those arguments. And so that's what I want to do with my content. I want to be able to show you all step by step how to be able to make your arguments against these or on these various issues so that anyone watching this later on can go and argue basically just as well as I could in that circumstance, right? That's what I want. I want to make it so that everyone who watches this video can leave and be able to correct any misinformation that they come across. And yeah, don't let the opposing side sow doubt, which, as we're going to get into, is a big motivating factor for why there's as much talk of fraud as there is. So, and thank you. I appreciate that. So what you're saying is we're going to use facts and logic. You could say that. You in fact could say that we are going to be using facts and logic, but also some things like logic and rhetoric. All right? Now, why don't we go ahead and talk specifically about the main arguments that we're going to be... RGR's the bait mom? I guess that I get... Hey, whatever you want to say. Let's go ahead and talk about briefly the 4 different arguments that we're going to be... the 4 different arguments that you will most likely face when we're talking, when you're debating with someone or arguing with someone over whether or not there was voter fraud. All right? I am very boomer. I used PowerPoint. People who have watched me for a while know that I used to use them. I want to use them more because they make me feel fancy and formal. Now, without further ado, into the arguments. So basically, in case you didn't pick up from the hypothetical, there are going to be 4 main arguments that you are probably going to face when you're talking to someone about voter fraud. The first is breaking news. All right. For people who were watching yesterday when I was actually doing research, there was someone who came into my chat basically with a breaking news argument. They were talking about, I believe, something in Michigan. And they were like, oh, well, here's some alleged evidence that there's voter fraud. Well, I think it had to do with like a glitch in a system in one polling location. And so they're like, aha, well, because there is this glitch in one particular location, then that must mean that there's a possibility of more glitches in other locations, right? These arguments are going to be coming at you hard and fast. And what I'm going to tell you to do right now, because I tried going over, I tried originally thinking about just going over every single one of them. But here's the thing about them. They just keep churning them out, right? Like that's what they do. They're going to they will keep churning and churning and churning them out as much as humanly possible. Really good sources to be able to go to. There is a comprehensive Twitter thread that I was looking at the other day, which basically addresses all of them. Like it's 100 tweet thread. Like it is way in there. It has a lot of good sources, citations. So that's where I'm going to direct you because otherwise this would be hours and hours long, right? But this has sources on the example that we were talking about that I had to talk about yesterday on my stream. This is where I would direct you first. And also there's a decent BBC article debunking Trump's arguments. I would also direct you here. Yeah, thread reader. Yeah, exactly. There it is. I direct people there. We'll come back to that later, right? But I don't want to get bogged down in breaking news because I hate arguing breaking news. So moving on. QAnon. So here's the thing with QAnon. This is going to be a really big subject. We'll do another future video on it. Depends on how quickly things develop. But we'll do a primer here, right? Because while I don't want to get bogged down into all the specifics of QAnon, what I can do is I can give you a primer on how to be able to deal with conspiracy theories. And that should be able to basically navigate you through any conversation which involves a conspiracy theory, including with QAnon. Okay? Third, the legal arguments. We're just gonna touch on them a little bit because I'm scared of giving legal advice or being construed of giving legal advice. Again, disclaimer, all that good jazz, but I'll give you what little information I feel I can while still riding the educational sort of line, right? And on the general nature of voter fraud and mail-in ballots. These are the people who just generally don't believe that mail-in ballots are credible and think that there was generally voter fraud in the election. What are the odds that Trump signals to QAnon in his concession speech? We shall see. But let's go on. So, let's talk about conspiracy. I think that a lot of people talk about conspiracy, but I don't think that a lot of people know what regular conspiracy is. Because there is a difference between conspiracy and conspiracy theory. Can anyone tell me what a conspiracy is? I'm going to give chat a second while I drink some coffee. Tell me what a conspiracy is. When people do crime together, close. The grassy knoll is a conspiracy. It's when a group of people might be hiding something. A plot, a group of people. Conspiracy is a plot against the powers that be. It's people who conspire together. Y'all are getting close. It's in the right area, right? But conspiracy is a real crime. This past summer, I worked, again, I've talked about it before, I worked for the Organized Crime Division of the Maryland AG's office. I worked on a conspiracy case, like on a criminal conspiracy case. And most basically, criminal conspiracy is where two or more persons agree to engage in an unlawful act to pursue an unlawful end or to pursue lawful ends through unlawful means. So let's be clear, like all that conspiracy is an agreement between two or more people to commit a crime. Bottom line, okay? And that's a crime in and of itself. Like even if you don't follow through on the crime, in some jurisdictions, you can still be charged with a conspiracy, even if you don't end up following through to the end of it, to the conclusion, to actually committing the crime that you agreed with the other person to do, right? And so the important thing to distinguish this from a conspiracy theory, oh wait, crap, is that conspiracy theories are all the same, except there is no proof of an actual agreement. Okay? This is very important because as long as you remember this, you can probably navigate your way through any conspiracy argument without actually knowing it at the front end. So this is important for a couple reasons, but let's talk about it. So when you respond to conspiracy theories, this is basically the steps that you want to take. First, you ask for evidence. All right, for people who saw me when I was on the stream the other day, the Dylan Burns stream, and I was talking to the conspiracy theorist, the person who was going on about Hunter Biden, right? Now, I don't know that much about Hunter Biden, right? I'm not following that story. I have no interest in following that story, right? But what I went in with was the first thing I did was I asked for evidence, right? That's the place where you start. Anytime you suspect that there's a conspiracy theory, always, always, always ask for evidence, all right? If they provide no evidence, proceed to dunk on them. Oh, you have this claim that you firmly stand by, but you literally have no actual evidence that you're able to prove it? Wow, that's really fucking weird. It's as if you don't actually need any kind of evidence or you don't actually need any kind of proof to be able to believe something. It's almost as if you're not actually operating from a state of logic. Rather, you're just like trying to make an argument because you want to believe it's true, right? Then you just proceed to dunk on them, right? Because if they don't have any evidence, then there's nothing that their claim is able to stand on, right? Bottom line. But if they do provide evidence, if they provide something, then that's where you have to evaluate what they provide you. Because 9 times out of 10, and it's really hard to get to that 1 out of 10 time, but 9 times out of 10, there's going to be some logical fallacy with it. Because otherwise, this would be a criminal, like otherwise there would be investigations into this. Otherwise, if there was proof like credible proof of a criminal conspiracy, then it would be pursued by law enforcement agencies. Like, that's how you determine whether or not, like, I can tell you, that's how you determine whether or not, like, an AG's office or any other law enforcement agency pursues one of these claims. And I can tell you because I've worked on one of these claims before. I love my experience. So, usually when you're looking at evidence, you want to evaluate for a couple specific, although this list is not exhaustive, but a couple specific, pretty common kind of logical fallacies. The first is hearsay. Can anyone... I followed Riley's model back when I listened to Alex Jones, and the result for you is giving up on Alan Jones. Yeah, I'm sorry. All right, but here, question. Another question. Does anyone know what hearsay is? This is a harder question. Please define for me what hearsay is. I won't be mad if you don't get it right. This is, I think, a question that people think should be common knowledge, but I find that a lot of people don't know what it is. Rumors. I heard someone say, yeah, only evidence is what people said, what someone says, secondhand account. Yeah, all right, you've basically got it. So basically, if we want to use really technical language, hearsay is when you take the truth of is when you use a statement for the truth of the matter asserted, right? Basically, it's when you take someone's statement and you take their statement of something being true as evidence that the thing that they said that the thing that they said is true is in fact true. The reason that this can be a logical fallacy is that a lot of statements don't have an inherent indicia of reliability. I don't have something on here, I'm just explaining it from memory. Because as it turns out, a lot of people can fucking lie or just be wrong. Now, there are some times when hearsay can be credible. For example, if it's a statement against interest. If someone says something which goes against their own personal interest, it has a higher indicia of reliability because, well, why would someone lie about something that would go against their own personal interest, right? Other examples include present sense impressions, saying something in such a quick time or such a quick reaction where you aren't able to, like, where no reasonable person could think of a lie in that moment. Like, there are a couple different examples, but, like, broadly speaking, when people use hearsay, that's a big red flag because people can lie or just be wrong. All right? Speculation. Can people tell me what speculation is? This one's a little bit easier. Theorizing about something without evidence. When you guess, just guessing about things, making assertion without real evidence by filling in the gaps. Observable opinions. We're all liars, no empirical basis. Kind of, yeah. Usually when we're talking about speculation, we're specifically talking about trying to tell or discern what someone else's personal beliefs are. This is analogous to inductive reasoning or subjective analysis, right? I cannot tell you with absolute certainty what someone else believes or what someone else thinks. Now, what I can tell you is what I think that someone else believes or what my rationally based perception is based on their actions, based on what they do. But generally speaking, when you talk about someone else's mindset, you can only talk about it to what you believe is in their mind. You can't actually say what's in their mind. That might be a little hard to understand for some people, so let me break it down. There is a difference between these two statements. Wow, she's really angry right now. I think that she's really angry at me. Or no, actually, that wouldn't even work. Wow, Stacy is really angry at me. She just hates my guts. She literally wants to murder me. There's a difference between that statement and this statement. You know, based on the way that Stacy acted, I believe that she's really mad at me. It is my personal impression that we are not on good terms. It is my personal impression that she may even try to commit harm against me, right? Yeah, that's a good example. We can't say that Trump is a well, actually, I don't know. It depends on how you define fascist. If you're using objectively or subjectively, we can't say that Trump believes himself to be a fascist, but we can say that Trump does fascist things. That would be a better way to revise that, right? I don't want to talk to Stacey. Yeah, not very base of you, Stacey. Yeah, I know, right? But that's the whole bit, right? If someone tries to make a statement about someone else's subjective mindset, that's speculation. And it's inherently not reliable. It's inherently unreliable because, as it turns out, none of us are mind readers, right? So avoid that kind of evidence or call it out when you hear it. The third, now lacking in foundation. Some of you got to it a little bit earlier. So some of you said when you're making a claim without any evidence for it. this would be that kind of a logical fallacy. And mind you, you got to the right place. It's not like you have to remember all of these by name. I just categorize them in my head by name because they go along with the rules of evidence for law school, but they stand on their own merits as logical fallacies, right? So basically, lacking in foundation is where, like a really good example, right, is where you have two pieces of evidence, right? Like, let's take Hunter Biden, for example. I think that two pieces of evidence that came up were that there were certain FBI records. There are certain FBI records that showed that on different multiple instances, the FBI had taken certain discretionary actions to either pursue or not pursue a case, right? I believe that's basically what the evidence was as it was presented to me, right? Now, the lacking in foundation, right, that you when you try to use that as proof of a conspiracy is that while you can certainly prove that those two things exist in isolation, you cannot prove why those things exist in isolation unless you have more evidence to be able to prove that. And unless you have that additional evidence, you are lacking in foundation. Think of it like you have two dots, right? You have dot A, dot B, and in order for them to make sense in your narrative, they have to be able to be connected. What you need is proof connecting those two dots together. That's the foundation that you need. But if someone is not able to provide that foundation and just constructs a narrative to be able to explain those in a way that they could be related to each other, that's lacking in foundation. It's also probably speculation as well because it goes to the mindsets of the people who made those decisions initially. But it's significantly lacking in foundation because there is no proof that those two events are connected or that they have the meaning attached to them by the person using them, right? It's basically correlation versus causation. That's a really good way to be able to look at it. Yeah, that's exactly it. It's correlation versus causation. You can prove that those two things happened, but not that they actually correlate to any larger theory that the person is putting forward without evidence to be able to prove that point, okay? And the last one, you don't see this as much, but it sometimes comes up, requiring an expert opinion. Every now and again, and this came up earlier in my channel, this might go to if someone tries to armchair psychology diagnose someone. So for example, if, I don't know, let's construct a hypothetical scenario where someone believes that there was voter fraud. All right, where someone believes that there was voter fraud, and the reason that they believe it was because they saw someone at like at a ballot counting station who they would make the claim was suffering from dementia or suffering from schizophrenia or suffering from some mental ailment, right? Now, this person making the claim has no background, no professional background to be able to make this claim, did not hire any professional to be able to make this claim, and otherwise has no professional evidence to be able to make that claim. That would be, you could say inadmissible, I don't know, I think in terms of admissibility, but that would not be credible because they're trying to make a claim that requires an expert opinion, right? They're trying to make a claim that they just can't because they don't have the requisite knowledge or background to be able to do so, and they have not consulted with a professional source to be able to come to that conclusion on their own, right? Like a lot of Corona skeptics. Yes, exactly. It's like the Corona skeptics. No, that's exactly right. Like the people who want to sit down and be like, oh, coronavirus isn't that big of a deal. It's not like coronavirus is actually like that dangerous. No, that's exactly what it is, right? Because those people are trying to assume that they have an expert opinion or that they're able to come to an expert opinion when they have no basis for being able to do so, right? That's exactly what that is. So yeah, that's really good. Armchair experts, yeah, that's what it is. But Corona skeptics also literally think experts are lying. Yeah, that's hard to deal with. We'll get into that. But basically, this is where most robust conspiracy theories will fall apart. And this is the reason why they are theories and not actual conspiracies. Because mind you, I think that some people can get hung up on this. Conspiracies are real, right? Like they are agreements between two or more people to commit a crime. You know, like that is a real thing. I think that a lot of people hear conspiracies and they think, oh, it's something that's hidden back in the shadows. It's something that can never be proven. No, conspiracies can be proven. That's a distinction between conspiracies and conspiracy theories, okay? As long as you understand the difference between the two and understand that you need evidence, credible evidence of an agreement in order to be able to get to a conspiracy, that's something that you can prove, that is where usually the crux of a lot of these arguments will fall. As long as you stick to this, you'll be fine in dealing with conspiracy theories. We're not going to deal with all the specifics of QAnon because that's a whole nother animal, but this is a good primer. Okay? All good? Good. let's move on. So again, I affirm I am not a lawyer. I'm not. But I also have done a little bit of research into legal arguments, right? A lot of people have been bringing up arguments that Trump is going to take this to courts, or that he wants to take this to courts. He said multiple times that he wants to take it to the Supreme Court. He's trying to use that as a bludgeoning tool. Yeah, it's a little scary. But fortunately, it seems like a lot of precedent on voter fraud generally seems to be generally in our favor. I'm saying this purely from an educational perspective. Don't take this to be any kind of like formal legal opinion. I'm just going to share with you some information from cases that I found from reputable courts, which could have some kind of value in helping you come to your own determinations about how things in courts would pan out if Trump tried to take legal action. So the Fifth Circuit, by the way, small primer, small aside, the circuit courts are generally going to be some of the most trustworthy places where you're able to find like good precedential value for legal analysis in the entire country. Circuit courts are basically on the same level as state courts, or state Supreme Courts, and they're only just below the Supreme Court, right? While they're not technically binding on other circuit courts, like their opinions aren't binding on others, they're generally taken to be really, really trustworthy by others. It's called persuasive authority, right, is generally what it's called, as opposed to primary authority, which a court has to follow it, right? So a lot of these are going to be circuit court opinions. So while they are not binding on every court in America, they are generally really, really strong persuasive authority. And for the circuits where they would want to try and take the court or claims up to the Supreme Court, they would have to deal with these specific precedents, all right? So the Fifth Circuit, in an opinion finding that Texas's strict photo ID laws is racially discriminatory, the court noted that there were only 2 convictions for in-person voter impersonation fraud out of 20 million votes cast in the decade before Texas passed its law. Like even the Fifth Circuit has already recognized that like there's so minimal evidence for voter fraud that normally it's a non-issue. Also, in its opinion, striking down North Carolina's omnibus restrictive election law, which included voter ID requirement, as purposefully racially discriminatory, the Fourth Circuit noted that the state failed to identify even a single individual who has ever been charged with committing in-person voter fraud in North Carolina. A federal trial court in Wisconsin reviewing the state's strict voter ID laws found that the impersonation fraud, the type of fraud where voter ID is designed to prevent, is extremely rare and a truly isolated phenomena that has not posed a significant threat to the integrity of Wisconsin's elections. Even the Supreme Court, in its opinion in Crawford upholding Indiana's voter ID law, noted that the record in the case contains no evidence of any in-person voter impersonation fraud actually occurring in Indiana at any time in its history. 2 of the jurors who weighed in at the case at the time, Republican-appointed former Supreme Court Justice John Paul Stevens and conservative appellate court Judge Richard Posner, have since announced that they regret the votes in favor of the law, with Judge Posner noting that the strict photo ID laws are now widely regarded as a means of voter suppression rather than of fraud prevention. The TLDR, the courts have recognized, broadly speaking, that voter fraud is basically a non-issue. We're going to get into the academic backing for this, and believe me, there's a lot, right? But yeah, it seems, at least based on this, that it would be difficult for Trump to be able to bring legal claims. So if you want to, again, I'm not trying to prescribe to you any legal advice, but here are some cool court cases for you to be able to rely on. You can see in the links. I'll post the links later on when I re-upload the video. So this way you have at least some ammunition to be able to enter into these kinds of arguments, right? Usually they're more on the merits and based on interpretations of the law. And generally speaking, the answer to most legal questions, if you watch Legal Eagle, is it depends. Here, it probably does depend, but it seems like there is more evidence to say than not that he would have a really hard time bringing this up through the courts. Which brings us to this. Now, fam, there is so much academic consensus on voter fraud. Like, there is so much consensus on voter fraud. We're not going to go over all of it here because I went over all of it on stream yesterday. But just to give you an idea, what we ended up doing was we compiled a document. And this document is going to be freely available for anyone who wants to make use of it. Ah, crap. Now, I went and I posted on my Twitter the other day. If someone who has access to my Twitter wants to drop the link here, then that would be super useful. But basically, in this document, we compiled over 80 sources. Over 80 sources, all reputable, all credible, which proved several key points. And I'll summarize them for you here. 1. Most concerns about voter fraud are rooted primarily in political misinformation, especially misinformation campaigns and racial hostility. Secondly, it's the overwhelming academic consensus that voter impersonation fraud is extremely rare, to the extent that it does happen, is unlikely to affect the outcome of any election. Right? Most of the studies that we found, right? Like most of them found that like the amount of actual voter impersonation fraud that they were that were able to be prosecuted, it's like 0.0001% of all of the evaluated ballots that the various studies looked at, right? Like it's such a small number that even to the extent that it arguably does happen, it has zero effect on the outcome of an election, especially when we're talking about districts which are close, but close by virtue of margins of like having 10,000 votes. Most of the studies that we found only were able to find like about 10 or so instances of voter fraud over the course of like 10 or 15 years, right? Like this is just not an issue. Even government investigations have also confirmed the academic consensus on the rarity of voter impersonation fraud. Like the government even agrees on this, or various state governments do. It is also the academic consensus that non-citizen voter fraud is extremely rare, and to the extent that it does happen, is extremely unlikely to affect the outcome of any election. This wasn't as big of an issue here because it wasn't raised by politicians, but normally when we talk about voter fraud, we also talk about it in terms of illegals, heavy quotations, being able to vote, right? And the fact of the matter is, there really just isn't that big of a problem of people who are people who are here without proper citizenship being able to vote, right? Because spoiler alert, most of them do not want to try doing something as crazy as like voting, because a lot of them really do not want to be deported out of the United States. And that's kind of a big risk reward for people who actually want to do that, right? Like if you want to turn over your personal information, and also mind you, the way that you're able to acquire ballots for a lot of people, especially mail-in ballots, would require you to have certain documents and certain information that you wouldn't have without citizenship, right? Like the amount of obstacles you would have to go through, and the amount of hoops that you would have to jump through, and the overwhelming danger that people who are here illegally would have to assume to vote. Yeah, it makes a lot of sense that this is not an issue, like at all. It wasn't brought up as much in this election because this election focused a lot on mail-in ballots, but when it is brought up, usually, especially in like prior elections, it's important to note that that's not really based in any kind of credible evidence either. And lastly, not only are instances of voting fraud through mail-in ballots overwhelmingly rare, and not only are there myriads of safeguards to prevent tampering and fraud with mail-in ballots, but also they've been used without issue and have received bipartisan support through the 2020 primary elections. Like there's so many safeguards to make sure that that mail-in ballots are not to be tampered with, right? Whether it's the way that they're constructed, right, for people who voted, and I hope that a lot of you did, the people who are able to legally vote, right? So you know that when you got your mail-in ballot, that you first put it into one, like you first filled it out. You had to fill it out with all of your personal information. You put it into one envelope, and then you put it into another sealed envelope, right? And then, I mean, at least for me, I went and dropped it off straight at my local UPS, right? So, you know, there's no worry about it being tampered with at the UPS. And if there is any possibility of tampering, well, it's going to be pretty immediately noticeable to anyone who's evaluating that ballot when it's being evaluated. If there's any tears on the seal, if there's any tampering, or if there's any changes on the face of the letter or on the face of the ballot, right? Because mind you, it's like I filled it out with pen, In order for them to change it, they would have to do a lot of shit to the face of that ballot, right? Like, there'd be so many steps that people have to go through to actually make a substantive change to my ballot that it's a non-issue, right? I assume you mean USPS, or yeah, sorry, US Postal Service. I apologize. Vote. Well, I mean, we already voted, but yeah. RGR vote. Oh, that's cute. Or that's cute. But yeah, right? Like mail-in ballots are overwhelmingly safe. And also, side note, they help prevent interference from like foreign elections, because it's really hard for foreign powers to be able to like fake mail-in ballots and be able to like alter mail-in ballots, because as it turns out, it's hard for countries which are not here to alter what's written on paper ballots, right? That might be a stupid thing to a lot of people, but actually, like, there are some sources that talk about how that's actually like a lot of experts think that's actually like a big strength of mail-in ballots, right? Is that you're able to vote remotely, but since we don't use the internet, there's like a lot less harm of like foreign interference being introduced. So also don't have to worry as much about like a foreign interference kind of argument here. Let's have a chat. Now let's go back to the hypothetical at the beginning, right? Let's talk about the 4 people that we were alluding to at the beginning, and let's go through each of them individually. All right. So the first person, breaking news person, the person who's like, all right, I've got 3 breaking news articles. I got proof, heavy quotations, that voter fraud is happening. So how do you respond to that? Well, the first thing that you do, go back to the sources. All right, go to the tweet thread, go to the source, go to the BBC article. It's probably already been covered, and by and large, and here's the kicker, it's likely not credible. You know. And I know that might seem to a lot of people to be like, oh, that's very permissive. Oh, that's very passe. That's kind of, you know, not that's taking a big assumption there, Riley. But the thing is that like we also know from the overwhelming academic consensus that the kind of things that they are accusing, especially Democrats, of doing, just don't happen in elections. Like, they don't. There are many, many, many safeguards to prevent voter fraud from actually happening. And to the extent that does happen, for you to do that, you have to jump through so many hoops to be able to do that, that it's not an issue, right? Again, I defer to all the sources that we looked at in the document if you want to read on that further. And we'll get to that more in a second. But the response to that first person, go to the tweet thread. You can talk, if you really want to, you can go through every single argument. Well, I'll get back to the mentality of that person in a second, because all the people in the hypothetical share a common feature. All right, so that's what you do with the first person. You go to the tweet thread, you go to the sources that we talked about, you look for whatever response you have for the breaking news argument, and you move on. QAnoner, start by asking for evidence. Actually, also do that for the previous person. With every person, you ask for evidence, right? That's like good step 0 to any argument. Basically ever, is ask for evidence. And you, being a much more prepared and smarter person, should always have evidence on your side. So what you do is you look at second person, the QAnoner, and be like, all right, well, what evidence do you have of this claim? And you go through, I mean, first, they probably won't have any evidence because most QAnoners aren't exactly functioning with like a high degree of scrutiny, you know? I mean, for the most part, most QAnoners will say something. I know, like, I was watching a Destiny video where he went to a Trump rally the other day. He walked up to a QAnoner and he was like, "Hey, so why do you believe what you do?" And he was like, "Oh, because of Hunter Biden's laptop. It's totally out there." And Destiny was like, "Oh, well, can we see it?" And he was like, "No, but yeah, it's totally out there. And also, there's actually a second laptop, which also has damning evidence." Which is just kind of amazing, considering that Tucker Carlson had to walk back the fact that they found a laptop. And actually, it doesn't exist. And other sources were able to confirm that it doesn't exist, right? Like, these people don't base their arguments primarily off of evidence, right? Usually, they'll base it off of hearsay or other things that they hear, right? So start there. Ask, well, why do you believe the things that you do? They'll respond with something that is very likely to be hearsay, speculative, or lacks in foundation. And then you just walk through logically from there, right? That's exactly what I did when I was talking to the person, I think it was Rob Noor, on the stream that I was on the other day. I would defer it to you if you want to see an example to go and watch that, okay? Third person. If you're talking to the legal fellow, I mean, I'm not sure if there's a lot you can do, because at the end of the day, it's not like, actually, here's a good thing that you could say, right? Because if they're actually trying to be like legally consistent, like if you're talking to someone who actually knows what the law is, right? Really a good kind of telltale for whether or not they're being, honest and acting in good faith is going to be whether or not they say something to the effect of, at least somewhere in their answer, it depends, right? When you ask them if they believe that Trump will actually be able to get, a decent legal proceeding or, get decent legal results in the courts, right? As long as they answer with some kind of it depends, there could be a good faith discussion there. That's like the one example where I think out of all these instances that there could be like a decently good faith discussion. Otherwise, I'm a lot more skeptic with the other examples. But otherwise, if they want to say definitively with 100% certainty that Trump is going to be able to go to the courts, it's really hard to be able to say that, because there's a lot of legal precedent that we already went over, which seems to point in the complete opposite direction. So that's generally the way that I would approach that. I'm not sure if there's a clear-cut answer, but you can cast doubt on that. And that's probably the most honest way to be able to respond to that, okay? And the last one, the general conspiracy theorist. And this is, I think, the most interesting person. The general conspiracy theorist, first, all right, so you ask them, why don't you believe in this? They say, oh, well, because mail-in ballots are inherently untrustworthy, because they lead to fraud, because there was totally election fraud. And the reason I believe that is because Trump daddy said it will, or I heard it from some like conservative news network, right? And so you say, all right, well, I actually have a lot of research showing overwhelmingly that the academic consensus is that mail-in ballots are completely safe, that voter fraud is basically a non-issue, and that most of the time when it's brought up, it's usually brought up in as a means to be able to cast doubt by political parties who want to cast doubt on the credibility of elections, right? Clipped, yeah, whatever. And so that's generally the way that you go with it, right? Like the way that you respond to conspiracy theorists. Again, first you ask for their evidence. They say that their evidence is, oh, I got it from Trump. You say, all right, well, I actually have evidence. Like I actually have real evidence, like real empirical data to be able to back up the fact that they're overwhelmingly safe and that this is probably a non-issue. The thing about that, because congratulations, you've won on the merits, right? By virtue of the fact that you can just kind of beat them with this wonderful research doc that we've made. I'm gesturing, but I don't know where the gesture to. Congratulations. Like, as long as you have that, and mind you, like, read it, don't just not read it, like, actually go through, make sure that you're able to answer at least some questions if you're asked about it, right? Don't just throw it around, because that's what we accuse a lot of people on the right to do, be consistent. It's actually not in the research outline. I'm going to be updating it pretty soon, but it's not there. It's on my Twitter. Someone posted it earlier. But it's a pretty easy argument to win against those people, at least like win heavy quotations on the merits. Now, here's the hard thing, right? And this is why, unless you feel very comfortable about your safety, I might not advise that you go to these kinds of events. This is me being very, this is me being mom here. I'm concerned about you, is because generally this is how I would see this kind of conversation going over. That person says, I don't believe that they're trustworthy. You say, here's credible evidence to be able to show that they are, and that concerns that they aren't are spread purposefully for misinformation purposes. They respond with, what do you mean? They respond with, it's really hard for me to say, because for the most part, these people are not rational, right? I think that there's a good kind of quote to be able to use here. And like I've said it before, I think I got it. It was either I got it from Destiny or Vosh or someone similar, right? You cannot reason someone out of position that they did not reason themselves into. There's a good likelihood that they will respond in some way to you saying that. And they're not going to be able to respond on the merits of the claim. They may try to ad hom at you. They may try to attack you. They may try, like, there's any of a number of things that they'll do. But what's most unlikely is that they're going to respond with reasoned thought, that they're going to respond with some reconsideration of, oh, I didn't know that. Thank you. And that's not saying that it can't happen. Some, there are good faith people who support Donald Trump who just don't know any better. We had someone on stream like that the other day. And I hope that you're still in chat. What's up? But when you're going to a rally like this, where people are already really hyped up in emotions and they're angry and they're furious and they're hurt that their big strongman president, who they were so sure was going to win, got kicked out by the guy that the president said was the worst candidate that he could ever go against. And if he lost to, then he would have to leave the country. Which I'm still waiting for. Hey, listen, Trump, if you want, hey, prove that you are honest and keep your word and get the fuck out of here. But the thing is, they're probably not going to change their mind. They're not. The reason that they believe that, if we're being completely honest, is because they got that from big, strong daddy uwu Trump, right? Like, that's why they believe that these things are that mail-in ballots are inherently untrustworthy, right? Like, Trump has been sowing this for months now, right? Like, all the way back since the beginning of the summer, when the coronavirus started to become a major issue, and we started anticipating that mail-in ballots were going to become a really big deal in this election, right? He's been saying this all the time. And so I want to really point out why I think what Trump did with this election is terrible, right? And this doesn't necessarily have so much to do with responding to the arguments, but I think it explains a lot about the kind of mentality that these people are operating from. I want to paint for you a picture where you have an incumbent president who is not exactly 100% safe or sure that they're going to be reelected. They know that they're not the most popular person. And they're a little scared. Especially when they have a pandemic thrown at them. And they really do not want that to reflect negatively on their image. So they do everything they can to hide it. So they do everything that they can do to lie to everyone. Because even though people would die by virtue of him not taking it seriously, he couldn't afford to let it rub off negatively on his image, which the irony is that I probably wouldn't have. And if he actually was kind of honest about it from the beginning, then probably would have been in a lot better position to win. Ironic, but hey. And so what you have is a recognition early on that he is not in a great place or a great position to have a surefire win at the upcoming election. And then there's some information that comes out from polling. And he sees that a lot of the people who are going to be voting Democrat are likely going to be voting by mail-in ballot. And this is some very interesting information to him. Because what you have now is someone who simultaneously has not released to the public the information he has, that we know he has, that the coronavirus is extremely dangerous and runs a high risk of, and I repeat, killing people. But he also knows that a lot of people who are going to be voting Democrat are going to be staying home because they actually take it seriously. But he also knows that a lot of people who support him don't take it as seriously because he hasn't taken it seriously. And so instead of actually being honest with his voters early on about the severity of the coronavirus, he decides to start taking advantage of the situation and simultaneously shitting on mail-in ballots, but also really pushing his followers to go vote in person. I want y'all to kind of consider the severity of this, right? You have a person who recognizes that you have a disease, that you have a pandemic that runs the risk of killing people when they're in close proximity and they're not following social distancing rules, right? But who will do, especially like the people who follow you, will do anything that you tell them, right? Or almost anything, right? Like they look up to you like they're God, Emperor Trump. But you also recognize that the people who oppose you are probably going to take this a lot more seriously. So what you do is you recognize, oh, well, a really good way to be able to hedge my bets in the upcoming election is by trying to shove as many people as I can who follow me to voting in person by virtue of downplaying the severity of the virus, even after I get it. And by saying that the ballots that come in through mail-in aren't credible. What the consequence of this is that you have a president who cares more about trying to win, who cares more about the strategy of trying to discredit votes that come primarily in favor of the opposition, but through mail-in, while simultaneously trying to get your followers to come and vote in person for you. It means that you care more about trying to win than the actual health and safety of your followers. That he was literally willing to let his followers go and vote in person and probably not follow any social distancing protocol and possibly fucking die. There's some statistics that came out that, Trump actually polled the best in counties which had the highest case counts of coronavirus, which isn't fucking surprising because their leader didn't take it seriously. So of course his followers aren't going to take it seriously either. We're not talking about a population that's acting rationally. We're not talking about people who fundamentally believe that Trump deserves to be fraud. Or we're not talking about people who fundamentally believe that there was actually fraud, right? Like that might be a secondary afterthought, right? And mind you, right now we're acting in speculation. Right now, what we're talking about is someone who valued an attempt of winning more than his own followers' lives. And followers who believe so much in their leader that they were willing to do whatever was necessary to try and vote in person. And people who have bought so much into his rhetoric that mail-in ballots are apparently untrustworthy, that mail-in ballots could not be considered as safe in this election, that there's really nothing that they could do. We're talking about people who are already acting unreasonably. We're talking about people who aren't taking the pandemic seriously. So for as much as you now having watched this video in the future, now you are able to argue with them on the merits, but understand that like there's probably not a lot that you can do to convince them. I think that there is good. I think that it is good to be able to respond to these people's arguments when you do so in a public forum, whether it's online or in person, where there are people who are reasonable who can be reached, right? Because you don't want them buying into the bullshit either. But as far as reaching these people individually, if you go in with the expectation of trying to do that, I'm not saying it's impossible. But I just want you to set your expectations accordingly, because you probably won't be able to. You can't reason someone out of a position that they didn't reason themselves into. So I hope that this was helpful. I hope that this shows you at least how to be able to navigate these arguments. But also recognize that a lot of these people want a certain outcome, and that basically reason themselves into that outcome, want that outcome to be true, and try to find post hoc justifications for making it true. And even if you disprove one, they're probably going to find another, or another, or another. That's like the whole breaking news mentality, right? Even if you're able to disprove one, then they're immediately going to jump to another one instead of considering whether or not the totality of the evidence that they're relying on is actually credible. You should be able to navigate arguments pretty easily now, but just recognize what's reasonable. Yeah. And that's it.